Turning back to this evening's program, we look forward to learning more about the relationship between the local food movement and global supply chains. We're pleased to welcome our distinguished panelists and moderator tonight, Joy Crump, Mitchell Davis, Sam Kass, and Alesha Black. Their full bios are on screen, but just to highlight a few key highlights. Joy Crump is a chef and the restaurateur behind Foodē, Mercantile, and most recently 6 Bears and a Goat in Fredericksburg, Virginia, and is a former Top Chef contestant. Mitchell Davis is the Executive Vice President of the James Beard Foundation and has been with the organization for nearly 25 years. He's overseen many new initiatives, including leading the team which created the U.S. Pavilion at the 2015 Milan World Expo. Sam Kass is a food entrepreneur, former White House chef, and founder of Trove. He led First Lady Michelle Obama's Let's Move initiative and served as a senior policy advisor on nutrition. He's also a Chicago native. And Alesha Black is our director of the Council's Global Food and Agricultural Program, and she'll moderate the discussion this evening. Thank you.
Great. Welcome, everyone. Excuse me. We're so glad to have you, and we're so glad to have this distinguished panel to have a discussion about the intersection of the global food supply chain and the local food movement. And I thought before we dive into the conversation, it might be good to know who our audience is, at least here in the room. Unfortunately, we can't do this with everyone online, but how many of you have ever visited a farm? Perfect.
That's amazing. Yeah.
How many of you have visited a farm in the past year? Wow. And then how many of you have ever visited a farm outside the United States? So we have a highly educated audience here about agriculture. Yeah, they self-select perhaps a little. And then one last question. How many of you would adopt the title foodie if you were asked? Okay. Less than have visited a farm. That's interesting. Okay.
How many of you would eat at Foodē in Fredericksburg, Virginia?
Perfect. So I think this is a really interesting conversation today, especially for us here at the Council, because for those of you who follow our work, you'll know that a lot of our discussion often focuses on extreme poverty and hunger and on the development of agriculture and nutrition systems in parts of the world that we may talk about a little bit differently today. So we focus often on Africa and on South Asia. Today we want to bring together this conversation we've been normally having with the popular conversation about our food system and about local food, about natural food, about different labels that might be influencing consumer choice and see how these might fit together. And so I want to start off with a conversation that's about the local food movement, maybe asking our panel to talk about what it is and then maybe where it might have come from and why it might be important to chefs. So I think maybe to start about what is the local food movement, I might actually ask you to answer this question, and then I'm going to maybe ask you to talk about how consumers might be driving some of that after, and then I'll go to you, Joy.
Sure. The local food movement is really this era we live in where I think chefs and foodies and even people concerned with health and the environment are looking closer to home to find food to support their lifestyles, their diet, their families, their friends, their nutrition, in a way that has come to stand for, or come to be represented by farm to table or the 100-mile diet, all these sorts of things. It's become a metaphor, really. And what's funny to me about it in the historical context of restaurants, of eating, is, of course, local food used to just be food, and everything else used to be something else, from somewhere else. And so at some point in our lifetimes, really, we've inverted from the way our food is sourced from coming from around us, or probably in our parents' lifetimes, to that being unusual or sort of stigmatized in some way, and chefs and others from Alice Waters on down celebrating things that grow nearby. And I'm not trying to judge either of those characterizations, but I do think it's been an interesting switch, where you used to go to a restaurant to eat food that was from somewhere else, in fact, and you ate food at home that was local because that was just food. And then we've inverted that model, and now we've created an era where things that grow locally also stand for a sort of politics, a kind of economic sustainability model that regionalizes the way things are produced and how economies locally develop and grow. And so I think the local food movement is characterized as a sort of a metaphor for this bigger sort of social view, worldview of a society that provisions for itself and in a wholesome, nutritious, environmentally friendly, left-leaning political way.
fair, yeah. And Sam, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about
was
how consumers, how consumers are driving this movement and why you think they're doing that. And we got a sense of that here, but what else?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the local piece is interesting. I think there's obviously some real benefit to trying to eat closer to home, but I think a lot of it is an attempt or reaction by consumers to try to figure out how to make better decisions. And there's so much complexity in the decision-making in the supply chains and decision-making process that consumer has to go through to try to figure out what should they be eating. And for those who are trying to do a better job particularly around sustainability, it gets really complicated. And I think this was a good attempt at trying to just come up with some kind of simple rule that you could try to follow to the best of your ability. It's deeply flawed in terms of just because something was grown not too far away doesn't mean it was grown right in a sustainable way at all. Or, in fact, most of the footprint of a food has nothing to do with the transportation. Now, there's other huge benefits, I think, from creating a culture that's valuing food that's built on relationships, that's built on transparency. So I think there's tremendous benefit. But so I think it's a piece of the answer, and it's a real. It's been the way that consumers most recently have expressed this desire for more transparency, better quality, and just fundamentally better food. And I think it's going to be one piece of the puzzle that hopefully, as we continue to push forward and consumers continue to demand these kind of qualities and ethos and ethics and principles in their food, that it will make up a sort of a fabric of a much healthier, more sustainable food system and food culture. So I see it as sort of another step in that direction.
Yeah, and you brought up a range of issues there. There's sociocultural issues, there's political issues, there's agroecological and sustainability issues. There's a lot packaged into this conversation. And I'm wondering, Joy, as a chef, why is it important for you to have a connection to the local producer, whatever distance that might be from you? What does that offer you as a chef, and what does it offer your customers?
Well, I mean, I think we're in, obviously, an information era, so people want to know everything, and they can. They can find out everything just simply by Googling it on the spot. So there's that to contend with. There's a wag the dog type of thing going on where we as chefs and restaurateurs try and stay with or even ahead of what's coming next, but we also try to drive what's coming next. So, it's sort of cyclical, and as people want to know more about where the food comes from, we need to gather that information. We need to be proud of that information. And as Mitchell said, there are very few chefs that don't want to go back to the root of what they love about food. It's very primal, it's very visceral, and it's usually connected to family and memories and the way they used to do things. That's just usually what is kind of boiling inside of chefs. So for us to go back to where we knew where our food came from because we picked it, or our parents grew it, or we knew the butcher's name, that just seems like a natural sort of flow of things, and I think that's just where we are right now.
Yeah. Do you find that your customers ask often who the producers are? Do you publish or in some way kind of put the information out there for them? Or
yeah, there's a lot. I would say my business is, my oldest restaurant is 7 years old, and 7 years ago I was painstaking about the process of really advertising where the farm came from, where the food came from, and trying to educate the people so that they understood the path that the food traveled to get to their plate. It was fascinating. As we grew and as we are growing, that task becomes more difficult, and you almost feel like you're an imposter if you are suggesting it came from someplace lovely when it really didn't. So we have to. I think we just try to be very, very honest, and we of course tout the things that we want people to. That we think will gravitate people to us, and that we know are supporting of our community. We tout those things, and then we sort of tolerate the things that we have to do to make our bottom line. But I think that's what everybody does anyway, right?
Yeah.
I think that's what everybody does.
I would add, so at the James Beard Foundation, those of you who don't know, we have a facility where James Beard lived in New York City, and we invite chefs about 220 times a year to cook dinners there. And we see trends happen because the chefs are coming from all over the country and all over the world. And there's already starting to be a pushback against local, where chefs are saying things like, well, I just buy the best, or it's less concerning to me, because at that level, I mean, which is a rarefied 1% level of expensive eating, chefs are trying to differentiate themselves. And at a certain point, if everything's local, it's harder to differentiate yourself than it is to sort of find another metaphor that is ahead, one step ahead, as you said, of where you're going. And I'm not saying that's good or bad, but you're already starting to see in some of the rhetoric, well, local is less important than the best thing I can get for you. And often local was a surrogate to say, well, this is better because it hasn't traveled, it hasn't been grown to ship, it hasn't been hybridized to XYZ. So that's changing that.
Well, and sometimes you can literally only get 10 pounds of what's local and what's best, right? So what do you do with 10 pounds of arugula? Not much, unless you just feature it, kind of as a fresh little garnish on your pizza. Well, now then you can have it and sustain it,
Right.
maybe through the weekend of sales, and it's that yucky justification and the reality of using the things that you are proud to use. How do you use them in a way that you don't just make 10 people happy, the first 10 who come in and get a arugula salad, you make 100 people happy because they get a little bit on top of their pizza.
That's why the fancy restaurants, you get like 3 pieces of arugula.
Right, exactly. Because
That's why
they
I'm
gotta
dying
make this much stretch. Yeah.
The truth is now known.
Well, you're already getting into my next question, which was going to be about trade-offs. So you've already revealed, some of the issues here with the trade-offs of having a purely local food system. That would make me venture a guess that a regional food system might be the direction that we're headed in, but we have a lot of commodities that are also globally sourced. Can you talk a little bit about each of you, from your perspective, what the trade-offs are of either a very global food system without much of a local connection, which you've already hinted at, or a fully local system? There's a couple things that come to mind. Do you want to start, maybe?
Sure. Well, I'll actually go back to my experience at Expo, which was a World's Fair where the theme was feeding the planet in the future. Many of us didn't know it happened here, but that's a whole other story. But there were 145 countries who participated, and one of the things that sort of germinated in my mind and has to do very much with this conversation was, well, we actually only have a global food system. I mean, we may localize pieces of it, we may whatever, but all of us every day walk into any store, even a hipster Brooklyn, 5-mile radius provisions shop where they're whittling axes and roasting coffee. The coffee there isn't from Brooklyn, and they're serving coffee. So this idea that it's...
They drink a lot of it.
I know, right. And so this idea that there's multiple food systems, whatever, there really is one food system. And it was there that I first began to question this idea, what is the impact, if we were to reach some local ideal and of the food movement, what happens then to the coffee growers and to the economic development questions that arise from that if we deny the fact that it exists? Then in November we get a president who tries to put America first and everything, and then there was this bizarre, uncomfortable resonance to me to say, oh, just local, just 100, just whatever, just here, when I actually want to say, actually I want the world, I want to eat everything, I want you all to come together. And so I don't really know, but those are the tensions that were going on in my mind in the last few years about what are we actually saying when we say we just want to eat our food here, and how does that resonate in other economic and political spaces?
Yeah. Do you want to talk about the Expo maybe and explain what that is a little bit more for folks who didn't get to see it or weren't part of it?
Well, just briefly, I'll just say
Yeah.
Mitchell's a hero. Expo was in trouble, and he really did an incredible job keeping it afloat and making it an incredible success in terms of what's happening in the United States with food. It was a pretty amazing experience to see the diversity, and I'm going to transition into my point, the diversity of the world on display when it came to food. I think the problem with all these kind of discussions for me is that we're trying to find this sort of weird utopia that is this pristine way of eating and everything else is bad, and this kind of one framework is the right way to do it, and if we can just get there, everybody will be good, and everything else is bad, essentially. And we're always, just by nature, looking for that magic bullet. What is the answer? What is the solution? And I actually think when it comes to these issues, that diversity is actually our most important word. And diversity in approaches of how we grow food, how we produce it, how we process it, how we transport it. And there's parts of the system right now that are totally backwards and don't make any sense. And some of that has to do with, length of supply chains and wanting everything all the time from everywhere. So there's definitely some correction, and part of the answer is going to be localizing parts of this, because I think we can see some real benefit there. But scale also matters.
Yeah.
If we want actual nutritious food that's grown in a sustainable way for everybody, it's not going to be a fundamentally local food system. Parts of it will be. And technology and innovation, I think, are actually going to be absolutely critical to making food grown closer, depending on the climate, depending on the location, actually affordable for an average person. But some of it's going to be about bigger scale, which is going to bring efficiencies that can get better quality. Now, a lot of those bigger scale systems need tons of improvement and need to actually be producing food that is good for people, not just good for profits or good for pushing down costs. But there's a balance there, and I think it's in that combination of different approaches that you're actually going to be able to provide food that feeds most of us. And I think that's the thing that part of the trade-off, the biggest trade-off for a lot of these kind of conversations is like, how many people are we including in this?
Yeah.
If it's just for us in Brooklyn, I can develop a pretty nice food system for you that is really idyllic. But once you start, and that's only for part of Brooklyn.
That's only for part of the year.
Yeah.
'Cause
Part
right
of the
now in
year
Brooklyn, not a lot to eat.
Part of the year for part of Brooklyn.
Local, yeah.
But if we're actually talking about trying to feed most of us food that's fundamentally good for our nourishment, which is really the foundation of why we eat, there's going to be some real trade-offs, and it's not going to reach that ideal. And I think that has to start incorporating in our understanding and in our openness to this combination of different strategies.
Joy, I was going to ask you about a specific trade-off that you kind of mentioned here, but this idea of seasonality, which is a trade-off. If we were to actually eat more seasonally, it would be different than how we're eating now, which is that people want to eat everything at all times. Is that something that you think customers appreciate? I mean, there's a long tradition in many places of eating seasonally because that's all we could do. Do customers appreciate when restaurateurs are offering that? Is that something you could imagine us going back to?
I think so. I think seasonality naturally brings with it variety. So people like that. I like that. And that's how we eat anyway. You want corn and tomatoes in the summer because that's when you can get them. That's when they taste the best. It makes sense. That's when we have them in volume and we put them on our menus. I had a chef when I first started, my chef who taught me a lot. And he told me that the food is local. Local food means where it's from, So we were in Atlanta at the time, but we got our cheese, we got a Parmesan cheese from Italy. That's where we got it from. And that was local to him. And we got our mushrooms, they were foraged in Northern California and shipped to us. And that was local to him because that was what was true to that ingredient. And it was his responsibility, he felt, to bring us, the diners, the best possible representation of that ingredient. And that sort of is turning the lens the other way and thinking about the ingredient rather than where you're placed on the map, the ingredient where that comes from. And so it gives us a little bit more allowance, first of all. And then second of all, I lost my train of thought.
Well, I would add about the seasonality question, one of the things that came to me from the Expo experience was actually living in Italy for a year, where you see on the ground really what seasonality means. And we joke even in my own rarefied world of food about eating seasonally, whatever. But when in Italy, I also taught graduate students for 10 summers a course in Florence. And by the second day, everyone is sick of artichokes, for Christ's sakes, because all you can get are artichokes everywhere you go. And we take for granted.
Totally.
And that's because they're in. And literally, the next day you go for artichokes, and it's all porcini. Yeah, suddenly the artichokes are gone.
They're gone.
And they freak out that, our students from mostly NYU are like, my God, where are the artichokes today? And the same dishes are now just made with porcini. They're exactly the same other. So
really tough life, Mitchell. Really tough life.
I know, it sucks.
Well, our hearts just go out to you.
But, I mean, or, and then you go to Japan, and there's another model of what seasonality means, and it also means the dishes and the way you sit and all the things that happen. And so we give lip service to these things, but I actually don't know that they're the answer for us, but this idea of looking for the best, or of everyone having access to the things at the best moment, and I don't mean the most expensive or the most rarefied or the most whatever, but just that there is a time when you go to the market, and because it's the season for something, they're cheaper, they're lush, they're full, you eat them now, you pickle them for later, you do all that thing. We've lost that sort of connection to food in a profound way. Even chefs, not even just people who eat.
And the ones who are bringing that back are the ones that are getting attention, and I think people are driving themselves to them. But what I was going to say before is I cooked in Alaska, where literally nothing grows. I mean, nothing grows.
Right.
It's horrible, except for salmon. But there was just, thank God for global food at that point. Everything was shipped in, and it was, you have to have that element in order to sustain any sort of community.
Very good. And I took a little catalog before I came down here because I wanted to have the right numbers here about some of these globally traded commodities that we're all consuming all the time that we may not be thinking about. So just as a framing for my next set of questions on how do we actually use the global food system? How do we include people in it who are already in it but to benefit more, which is the smallholder piece that we're often talking about here. 80% of the coffee in the world is produced by smallholder farmers, which are these farmers that are on very small plots of land, the type that we're often talking about. That's around 25 million farmers worldwide. And that's, I learned today, that's the second most traded commodity after crude oil, coffee.
Wow.
Oh.
Put that in perspective, yeah. 90% of cocoa comes from smallholder farms that are obviously at less than 3 hectares. That's about 2.5 million families. Most of those are in West Africa, but they in other parts of the world obviously as well. And cashew, and these are just 3 of the big supply chains that are smallholder based. 2 million farmers in Africa are producing the cashew. The rest are in India, Vietnam, and Brazil. And just to give you a size on just the cashew sector alone, that's a $2 billion, that's a value of $2 billion what they produce. And then the other thing I learned is the most highly traded food commodity, if you think of food consumption, is fish, to your point. And that has gone off the charts in the last couple of years because of the advancement of freezing technology. So that used to be hyper-local, that you really could only get fish in a very local area, but now it's skyrocketing, and especially with the development of the aquaculture industry as well, in addition to fresh caught fish. So I'm just bringing those into the conversation to say, part of the inspiration for this conversation was to get to your point, Mitchell, which is that it's one system, and there are producers around the world who rely on supplying us with delicious coffee and cocoa and many other commodities, and there's a benefit. There's got to be some way that we can more fully involve them and help them benefit from this food system. I'm curious, thinking about what you said about food is local, where it comes from. We know where Parmigiano Reggiano comes from because of how it's produced and the way it's been branded. But curious for the farmers around the world that are producing these commodities and others, how might we be thinking about how to include them more?
Well, how might we be thinking about how to include them more? You start.
What I'll say is commodification is a really bad word in some circles. And what was interesting as you were reading those numbers, right? So yet commodification creates the commodity market creates a market for these smallholder farmers to gain some economic agency, really, like puts money in pockets. And so somehow that's not necessarily bad from that perspective. And I don't know what the mix, to Sam's earlier point, that we are talking about a sort of multifaceted food system that has these global issues and these local issues. The thing that if you lay over those statistics is that the reality is that the economies with the most money to pay the most for those things then sort of drive those markets. And fish is a perfect example where, the world, the oceans will be outfished maybe 10 to 20 minutes by the time we're done this conversation. And all of that is going to go to the people who can pay the most or who respect the most. And the thing that I think that is lost in the commodity market and that comes back in the local movement is the culture out of which those things are taken. So there's no way in that economic system to add the value. In fact, it does the complete opposite by design of the cultural relevance, the values, even the way they're produced, to find that, to balance the price, the externalities, whatever you want to call it in that system. And if there were a way to tag on, maybe it's a technological solution, tag the cultural value, the environmental value, all these externalities that are not just about the commodity itself, and put those through the system, we might find a way to balance it a little bit more instead of exploiting it, as you said, just for cost and profit. I don't have the answer to that, but it does feel like there should be something in the middle between raping the items and the culture from which they come and the economic benefit that comes with those things.
Yeah, I think you can, it would be difficult for any one person or any one community to only indulge in one thing one way. You have to compromise whatever your intake is based on what you can afford and its availability and your own personal principles. And that's how we cook. We try and be as responsible as we can be. We try and source as locally as we can where it makes sense. And we try and pass that information on to people who care in the same sense. Like, you may not be able to eat that way every night. You may not care to do the research or the homework, but it's there if you want it. And when you want to indulge, you can take it on in that measure. And when you feel a bit more lax, you can go through drive-through, whatever. It's really what I think. There's always going to be degrees in wherever we're talking about it locally, community-wise.
I think, so kind of two big points, and I think the first one especially is really going to be consumer-driven. We have to start expecting that in our coffee and in our chocolate and in our fish are some fair trade practices. And so fair trade has made, I think, a really good, at least initial attempt at doing this. I think technology is going to help a lot because really one of the biggest problems in these supply chains is that none of the big corporations are buying directly from those farmers. They're buying from distributors. So somebody's going and buying up all the coffee and all the chocolate for almost nothing because these small farmers have no direct access to the marketplace. And then they're turning around and selling it for like 10 times. And then the big corporations are making the huge profits there. So if those small farmers can start, and this is where technology can help, and there's some people working on this, can have direct access to the market and cut out that middleman, there's a huge amount of economic benefit that can be brought to those small farmers, and which can then be invested back into the farm to have more sustainable practices. I think the other big thing we can do for all those people you talked about is deal with climate change, because when you actually look at what's going to be impacted, experts are now predicting that for our kids or our grandkids, they won't have access to chocolate, to coffee, to wine, to shellfish, to lobster, to shrimp, and to a number of other kind of fish, because those crops are very sensitive to weather. Like coffee needs a really even climate. It cannot deal with like a bunch of spikes, which is what we're going to get. It cannot deal with drought very well. Same is true with chocolate. And so probably for our grandkids, if we keep going on this pace, coffee is going to be like caviar. It'll still be around, but it's going to be really expensive. And in the oceans, part of the reason why some of the models, we're starting to accelerate, but it's sort of lagged a little bit, is because the oceans have been absorbing actually most of the heat, and we're getting tremendous amount of acidification because the ocean's absorbing the carbon. So the shells of shellfish and lobster and all those crustaceans, which are a bunch of the foundation of the food chain, they can't form, they get very weak. And once that starts to collapse, it affects the entire food supply chain. So if we care about these farmers more than just our ability to have, and even if it's just for pure selfish reasons, forget about the farmers. You just want chocolate and coffee and wine, right? That's good enough for me. I don't really care about what people's motivations are, but whatever it is, we have to really get serious about this. Otherwise, we're going to see the sort of food system as we know it, as unacceptable as it is now, as much progress as we need to make now, it's going to be almost impossible to maintain the status quo if we even come close to what climate change is going to do, and all those farmers are going to be decimated. So I can't think of anything. There you go.
Do we know how to have fun or what?
So I don't think there's anything more important to do than that. But you start coupling some real aggressive transformation there, as well as some of these technological solutions. I think we can start to make a lot of progress pretty quickly, to be honest, on those issues.
Yeah, great point. And I think a lot of those predictive models about those commodities that you mentioned and the climate change links, one of them is related to pest and disease incidence because it's going up so fast as the temperature is rising. And with cocoa, there's just a lot of diseases that attack those plants that are threatening. I was going to mention one other thing that often is a product of these global supply chains, which is that there's a lack of processing near where the producer is, so it's often removed as a raw commodity and processed elsewhere. So an example of this is when I was at the Gates Foundation, we did a project in Ghana around cashew because all of the cashew was being exported to India for hand processing. So raw cashew apple, each cashew is in an apple, there's one, was all going to India, where then individual people were unwrapping these cashews that were then being shipped to us in whole form. And if they were broken, then there was a secondary market for a lower quality nut. So in collaboration with the cashew industry, they opened the first cashew processing plant in Ghana, which is amazing to me that cashews have been coming out of Ghana for how long, and there was no processing facility until then, which just shows you kind of how these supply chains.
That speaks to your earlier point about regionalizing the food system,
Right.
even just in America, that you cannot, it's hard. Apples in New York State can't be processed for the New York school system in New York State because there's no apple sorting facility in the state. Like that same model sort of has led to some bizarre
Huge
That
problem
explains
in
why
meat.
it's so
problems.
expensive.
Yeah.
Huge problem in meat in the United States
Yeah.
for that, which we try to take some action on towards the end of the administration. But you want locally produced meat that's more sustainable, not on a giant lot. The biggest challenge is processing that meat in state. Very, very hard for small farmers to do. One of the keys to unlocking a lot of that potential, which I think that part is critical in terms of you want more sustainable meat production.
And there are people there are philanthropies, there are
lots of
people, there are organizations working to regionalize that. But in the economies of scale, I mean, to Sam's point about exploiting everything out of the food, those are some of the things that were lost that may not be exactly about local food supply, but certainly local economies and development and minimal impact to the extent that it can be.
We were talking a little bit backstage, actually, since you brought up some of the issues that you were working on in the administration. We were talking about some of the big wins and maybe some of your thoughts as we have a new administration on what you'd like to see maintained. Do you want to talk at all about some of that?
So happy you brought that
Should
up.
we move over here?
Yeah, right?
How much time do I have? No, I will be succinct. What do I want to see kept? I want to see it all kept. I want to see a lot more of it done. I mean, the fact of the matter is, the President and First Lady picked every piece of ripe fruit there was from the executive office when it comes to food, nutrition, and environmental work. There's obviously no administration in the history of the United States that's come close to the work that the Obama administration did across that those whole big parts of the food supply chain and the environmental impact. There you go, I got one person. But the fact of the matter is there's a tremendous amount more work to do. A lot of the key problems that need to be solved cannot be solved by the executive office, has to be solved by Congress, by changing the laws or creating new laws. We have huge waves of technology innovation coming in. We have an updated oversight and regulatory. I mean, we're like 20 years behind, 30 years behind, and you have a whole new, like fundamentally new technologies coming on the scene that we're just utterly unprepared for, and just huge actions that need to be taken. So the notion that, that Secretary Perdue's first thing that he'd do was try to make sure we could get make sure there's a lot of salt in school lunch, considering the stakes is just baffling to me. And I think the thing that he'll find quickly is that people care about this. In school nutrition, it's like polls at like 90-something%. And there's not any parent who's like, yes, make sure my kids have a lot of junk food when they go to school. Like, it's just not, maybe years ago, but not anymore. And I think, I hope that the actions stop here, because I think they're going to run into a pretty hard wall of resistance from lots of people all over this country who care about this issue. But it'll be a real test for how much do we care and how engaged we are and how much people are going to motivate, because if there isn't pushback and if there isn't resistance and not a political price to pay, then, they'll keep going and keep rattling the sword. So, but the stakes are just too high, and you just would hope that anybody in office is going to do what's best for kids, if for nothing else. And that should be the sort of guiding principle that I hope this administration takes. Hope.
Yeah, hope. Are those Trump stakes that are too high, or is that some other kind of stake? At the Beard Foundation, I was saying earlier also, last year at our annual summit, we were trying to get strategic and sort of look at the movement as a whole and where people could do, organizations were making progress, what it looked like, and of course things have changed this year. But one of the things that we feel pretty strongly about is food is moving in a direction from the work that Sam and the Obama administration have done, but from the work Alice Waters did, from the work that all of us are doing sort of in our own lives. And what we want to do is not let the politics of red and blue get in the way of that in this moment. And there are so many other things. I myself, when I think about, Sam saying get political about food, well, yeah, but also human rights and like there's so many things on the list of things you have to get political about. I want to take food a little bit outside of that spectrum and keep pushing from the consumer level, from the corporate level to continue that change. In this global food system, we are just one country. I know we're a big one with a lot of power and a lot of people and a lot of food. But other global food companies are getting this pressure from all over the world to change in certain ways and to do certain things. I just think we have to keep applying it from all sides as individuals to make those choices that are better for us and for everyone.
So I think what we have right now is a cultural transformation. I don't think we have a movement and at all. In fact, I experienced that for 6 years in Washington. And I think some people are working hard to try to build it, but it's not there. And while, Mitchell, I totally agree, I think the momentum of the cultural transformation underway is the foundation of any kind of movement. It is the foundation of what good food, it's the foundation of how you get better food, because ultimately food is the deepest expression of our culture, and most of the problems in food come from our culture, don't come from our politics. But that is to also say that a lot of the problems cannot be fixed without political action. So while I agree with you that continuing to feed and push and accelerate this cultural transformation is absolutely important, and so many food advocates just think it's all about policy, and could not be more wrong. But I will say that unless we turn these issues into votes, there's a real ceiling to how far these actions are going to go. And politicians are not going to make any changes, spend very much capital, unless you have somebody like Michelle Obama who personally really cares about this, unless voters are demanding their politicians take action and take stances and have policies on these issues. And that's where we are. That's where we have to go. And so I think that's the work. But we have everything we need. We're at that moment. The exciting part is getting to that moment is the hardest part. Turning into political action is actually much easier than starting a cultural change. Changing culture is the hardest thing to do. So that part we should be really excited. We have so much momentum, and we have accomplished so much in relatively little time if you look as compared to, say, the environmental movement. We're kicking butt. But we have to feed that, right? and then start taking those real steps to take it to the next level.
We have so many questions, and I want to get to them. So on the online system, I think I've got 20 or 30 questions for you all, and we've got people in the room here who I know are burning to ask questions. So I want to get to that pretty soon here. But before I do, I want to ask another question. I get this question all the time. I bet you all get this too, which is, I care about food. I want to be a contributor to a sustainable, socially conscious food system. What choices should I be making? What can I do to help this? And so people will ask me, should I buy only organic? Should I buy only local? They want these silver bullet solutions, which we've just talked about. This is all about trade-offs. But what do you tell people when they ask you, how can I be a good consumer?
Who wants to go first?
Joy.
I can go. I always equate it to something that I struggle with, which is how do I lose 10 pounds? All the time. I always have. And so I don't lose 10 pounds by going on a crash diet and never having the things that I love, because then I only lose 1 pound and then I'm off of it because I broke my diet. I think that you should start with realistic goals. And every little bit makes a difference. And it sounds cheesy, but every little bit makes a difference. So if you decide that you're only going to buy, if you can't afford to buy all organic produce, or you're not moved to do so, or you don't have the access to it, well, maybe you're only going to buy organic produce that's thin-skinned, like grapes. And you can buy your mass-produced watermelon and your oranges that you peel, but maybe you want to buy, thin-skinned vegetables that are organic, because that's a little bit better for you. And then after you do that, maybe you want to try doing just your bigger meats that are whole, that you bring into your home. Bring those in locally. Well, all of a sudden, if you do those two things, you've made a stamp. And if you do that, and the person next to you does that, and so on and so on, I just think you should set realistic goals for yourself. And then when you reach those goals, if we reach them as a collective, then all of a sudden you've made a wave.
Mitchell,
So that's what I tell them.
thank you.
I mean, I would say one thing not to do is to become a foodie. Like I spend my life in a lot of environments where everyone thinks if only everyone just cared about food as much as we did, then the world would change. I mean, to Sam's point, well, we've made tremendous strides. I just read the recent article about how the alternative food movement has won because we all eat yogurt now, we all eat granola, all these things that were so rarefied. It's hard to. 30 years ago, you had to go to a health food store to buy granola, and you were a weird person who ate granola. Right? All these things have become natural. We eat things in bowls and grains. So there has been this tremendous shift. But to wait for everyone to care as much as I care about food, I don't want to be in that world. I don't want to have dinner with you. Like, please care about something else. So I feel, to Joy's point, it's like, go about your life and be a little mindful about what you eat. You're mindful about the apps you download on your phone. You're mindful about the books that your kids read. And please don't just take food for granted, but pay a tiny bit of attention or make a decision, as you say, one thing at a time. We sort of... It's almost the way our politics went. We just took it all. We were consumers, like in the truest sense, without paying any attention to anything else. And people are starting to pay attention for whatever reason, because they have kids, or because their parents get sick, or because they just don't feel so great. And they found if they don't eat bread with gluten, they feel better. Whatever that is, that makes you mindful of food in a way that I think when we're not mindful, it disappears and we don't think it's important. To go from there to political to all the sorts of other things, that will be great. But just don't think we just all have to care so much about everything we eat and make our own everything, because the change is never going to happen. It's only going to be a small group.
Yeah, I really agree with that. I guess I would start by we just have to eat a more diverse diet based on fruits, vegetables, whole grains, legumes. Like, if that's the foundation, I love meat and I will always eat meat. We all need to eat less meat, certainly the average American consumer. But I think to realistic goals, if we have that kind of as our foundation and we're eating some meat, but less of it, better quality, we're well on our way. And to do that, we have to set ourselves up for success. So basically what we're doing right now is buying a bunch of bad food, and we're surrounded by it in our communities, and then we take some of that food home, and then we put the cookies on the counter, and we just stare at them, and we try not to eat them. We try, and then of course eventually we eat them, and then we feel bad, and then we start to lose hope, and then you stop trying, and then it's a vicious cycle. Because basically we eat what we see. And so we have to surround ourselves with to make it easy we have to make this easier on ourselves. Coke built their entire business on with an arm's reach of desire, meaning surround people with Coca-Cola and then make them want to desire it. Brilliant. One of the most successful companies in the history of the world. We have to just do the basic same playbook, which is surround ourselves as individuals in our communities with better food, and then work to inspire people to want to eat it. So I think first is just try to do, that just means more fruits, vegetables, whole grains, and drink water. And then share that. And so I think it's shared with your friends and family, because that's how culture changes. Like, if you're like, how about an apple? That's how you start to build out your culture. So I'd share it there, I'd share it in your workplace, and then I'd share it with your representatives. And if you just share that desire to just do a little better, not in a dogmatic, crazy way, but in just a sound, principled way, that's how I think it starts to spread. But we can all take a deep breath on this stuff too. I mean, I think if you eat a Twinkie, I still love you. You know, it's okay. You know, because it does have to be realistic and pragmatic. And if this isn't a joyful, pleasurable, future that we want, that's tasty and delicious and fun and has a couple ribs every once in a while, like, I don't want that future. And if we want people to come to that future, it's got to be one that has that's based on the joys of life. And so I think that's critical, but in a realistic way, not in a Mitchell's life way, because I look at his Instagram and I'm like, man, another meal?
But I would add,
it's unbelievable. I can't keep up with this guy.
It also has to be in an American way. Like, I also think we are sometimes looking to find solutions that will not resonate no matter what we do with who we are here, you know? And you just can't take away the Coca-Cola and the McDonald's, because then you've taken away who we are. And I mean that profoundly, just as you couldn't take pasta out of the Italian diet and say no one should eat pasta anymore. People tried. The Futurists, famously, the art collective in the 1920s, and wanted Italians to never eat pasta again, considered pasta was poison as an art project. But what they were saying was, it's so part of our identity, you can't really let something like that go. And I said sometimes we try to demonize or stigmatize things that become counterproductive for the movement, because you can't. No, I want a McDonald's sometimes. I had every birthday party of my childhood in a McDonald's. Like, I feel like there needs to be. Yeah, really. Yeah. Well, my mother cooked all of our meals, and so it was fun to go out to McDonald's for something special when she wasn't cooking. Yeah. But so I just think you can't. We sometimes forget that cultural piece. There's been tremendous shift in the food, but it's like it's who we are, and we have to. I mean, we've said this in different contexts together, but at the Brit Foundation, we have to imagine an American identity of food that includes the things that make us who we are and unique in the world, the same way the French do, the Japanese do, the Chinese people in the world. Can't negate those things. It's not just nutrients, but it's culture. And we have to find a way that we all agree or not, but that means who we are.
Got it. Well, we're going to go to audience questions here, and I have so many from the app here, and I will reference a few of them, but I thought to get started, I'm going to take 2 from the floor and then 1 from the app, and then we'll kind of choose which ones we each want to answer. So I see this gentleman here in the middle had his hand up first, and then who's got the mic? You've got the mic, sorry. And then I saw a hand over here. I'll come to you next. We'll do 2 and then cycle through.
Hi, Jim Slama, Family Farmed. So Paul Hawken just came out with a book called Drawdown, which looks at solutions to climate change, 100 of the best researchers in the world. And essentially what they found was that the industry with the most impact is food. And I really haven't seen a major focused response to the fact that the best solution to climate change, according to 100 of the best researchers in the world, is food, whether it be cutting down on food waste or a lot of it sequestering carbon in the soil through organic and pasture-based systems and lots of other things. So for this esteemed panel, how do we get the word out that food is a massive solution to climate change when we have an administration that's just gutting all the amazing things that the Obamas did to start moving us in the correct
Well, we got to
direction?
win elections. We got to vote. But that's where it matters. I mean, that's where this stuff, really matters, is that, voters got to care about this and they got to vote on it, number one. I think number two, I think there's it's looking at food versus energy in terms of its impact on climate change. I was at COP21 where they signed the big deal. And, energy, the numbers are debated. But energy is about 30%, food's about 25%, but that doesn't include transportation, about global greenhouse gas emissions. So it's right up there. It's close. It's a number 2. But it's not a number 2 for long, because the curves on food and agriculture greenhouse gas emissions are like this. And energy is flattening out. We can see where the curve can come down, largely because for decades we've been investing huge amounts of resources into technological innovations that are going to transform how we are producing our energy. The thing about energy is that if you get a couple big solutions, they can be scaled relatively easy, right? Nothing's easy, but you can adapt a better energy source that's cheaper and has less impact on the environment. It's going to take a few decades, but just like coal has gone around the world, there's going to be the next solar starting to go, and it's going to be we'll see how many coal jobs are back in the next few years. But food and ag is different. Food and ag is like there's not going to be like three solutions that it would just scale, right? Where the whole work is just scaling some solutions that people came up with and iterating on those fundamental solutions. Number one. The solutions are going to be much more complicated, much more nuanced. You're dealing in the heart and soul of people's culture. Like, nobody cares where their energy comes from. Like, we just want to turn on the lights. Consumers could care less, the average consumer. So you can come up with something better that's cheaper. Okay, great. The difference is you're going right up against some of the hardest cultural forces, which means you're coming up something against the hardest, most complicated politics in every country around the world. So the effort that's going to be needed and the complexity of trying to solve these solutions is so much greater that politicians right now are going for what is number one and what is a much easier. I mean, look, battling energy sector is not easy, but it's a hell of a lot easier than fighting in ag. And the solutions aren't there yet because we haven't been innovating. We haven't been investing resources to come up with these kind of solutions here. So we have to first start with better research, better companies that are doing fundamentally better things in terms of making these kind of systems much more scalable, less resource intensive, and particularly like human resource. Part of the problem with a lot of these systems, it takes a lot of people to do them. And so that means the products that are coming out of them are more expensive. So we have some real grappling to do with kind of what is that system we want. But I think it's that's the kind of work. I think that's the reason it hasn't come, because we also haven't found a language to engage the consumer to say, yes, this is what we expect and this is what we care about and this is what we're voting on. So if you want to do this one, that's the work. I agree with you.
I would also just add, it's hard enough for us to get people to understand the connection between what they eat and how they feel or what happens to them on a personal level. And now we're trying to get them to make a connection between what they eat and what happens 10 years from now on the ocean temperatures. And I'm not saying that's not a leap that can happen, but we even see it in the food waste rhetoric that's going around right now, which the Beard Foundation has signed on to help tremendous sort of global effort to reduce the amount of food waste for methane gas reasons. But all anyone wants to talk about is hunger, stopping hunger by eating food waste, when actually it's an environmental push to get the organic matter out of the thing. It's just a hard connection to make, like I know people who don't realize that they don't feel well after they eat horrible things, or whatever, right. We're trying to find a gene for things that are, you just ate something. You know what I mean? So we're trying to make this tight connection. I just think we have to be cognizant of that when we're trying to find solutions for that, because it's not the cause and effect, regardless of what you believe or what the science says, is not our biggest.
Yeah, but I actually think food is really powerful there.
Can be, sure.
No, because I think, unlike energy, which is like gases in the air, 2 degrees, like we're in Chicago, like 2 degrees sounds great here, right? It's like, let's heat this baby up, But when you start talking to the average consumer, like you're not going to be able to have wine, coffee, and chocolate, people are like, oh my God, like what do I got to do, right? They're ready to riot,
right?
And so I think part of what's powerful about, we have to tell a better story. And we have to talk here. We're talking here. Nobody makes changes in their behavior when they speak to people, cerebrally. You make changes. Ask any company that knows how to market. They don't talk to your brain, they talk to your heart, they talk to your emotion. And so we have to tell a better story. And food is actually the most powerful way to tell the environmental story that is most tangible for consumers, because they're relating to this every day. And so I think we make it about, like what's happening right now. Food prices are going up right now. They're not going up in 15, 20 years. Like that's happening now. And so I think we need to make it immediate. We need to make it personal. We need to make it directly about the next generation. And that's where you can start to get more people to buy into this vision, this idea. But if it's too like science, regenerative, all this stuff, which is super important, I personally am in, like that's not what it's going to motivate people. Soil isn't going to motivate the average consumer. As much as I love it and care about it and dig in it every weekend, it's not our narrative. And so I think we got to work on honing that if we want to start unlocking the potential of the consumer to drive a lot of this change.
I'm going to go to this question in a second, but before I do, I'm going to take this question online that is related to this conversation. So the question is, there's the challenge with this topic is we often discuss it from a place of privilege. How do we make food discussions and issues more inclusive? So we were just talking about hearts and minds. How do we actually make it a less privileged conversation?
I think that you can't run away from the emotion of it. I think food is very visceral, it's artistic, it conjures up memories, it connects us one to another, and you can't hide that. You can't walk away from that. And I think also we have to be willing to wear more than one hat. You know, we can't just be consumers, we can't just be chefs, we can't just be advocates. We have to come from different angles, because when we do that and we are sensitive to the other perspectives and our other responsibilities, then we have chef advocates, and then we have consumers who are also policymakers, and we have more responsible learning and more connectivity, which is overwhelming in some ways. You can't stop thinking about how one thing leads to the next and the next, like you were saying, it drives you batshit in some ways, but you also have to sort of wrap your arms around the responsibility of that connectivity. And again, just take a little piece of it. Just eat the elephant with a fork and knife. Just take a little piece of it so that you can start to conquer it all.
Yeah.
You know?
I also, I think there's a lot of racism and bias in the way food movement thinks and talks about this stuff. There's this notion that somehow people with lower incomes like don't want better food, and like this is just part of like a cultural thing. It's like that could not be further from the truth. People are a product of what they're surrounded with, but when you surround people with food they can afford, I've never met a person who doesn't want to eat better. And the question just becomes like, what's our priority? Are we prioritizing this perfect local food system, or are we prioritizing getting any kind of vegetable to everybody? And it's just a question of how we are, you know, looking at what is our goal. And right now, so much of it is about trying to reach this ideal, as opposed to just feeling like, I don't care how the carrot was grown. I just know I'm from Hyde Park, and I know I was surrounded by, on three sides, of people who didn't have access to carrots, period, of any kind, organic, sustainable, whatever. And I would love a conventionally grown carrot all over those neighborhoods at a price people can. That's progress to me. And so I think, you know, the progress is going to look different. So like in Hyde Park, let's get the organic, like, you know, carbon sequestered carrot, and then like around, let's make progress there. And then, you know, the goal should be everybody should be having the best food possible. But it can't be that somehow, you know, that conventionally grown carrot isn't seen as progress.
I would just
so
add
many communities.
that last night at the Beard Awards, which were here in Chicago, we elected Michelle Nishan, who is a chef and an advocate to our Who's Who of Food and Beverage, and that was for his work at Wholesome Wave, which has shown in I don't know how many states now, 42 states, they double the value of SNAP benefits people buying food in farmers markets and on fresh local grown produce. Like those people want that money. That no one doesn't want. To Sam's point, he has real data. There is not a lack of desire. There's a lack of access, a lack of affordability, and so it's those of us who have the privilege to be in some positions of power in the food movement need to take that information into account and make sure that they're not left out of that conversation.
So this question, did you have your hand up? Yeah.
So you did start to touch on this, but one of the things that bothers me so much is the food waste, which you mentioned. And it just seems to me if we could put some, you know, political power, like in France, that they have the new laws about wasting food, but also you talked about our culture shift. How do we shift our culture so that it's really a bad thing to waste food? Because people just, I mean, you know what they do. It's terrible from restaurants, grocery stores, and individually. I think it's a tremendous question, and to me it goes back to that, like what it means to be American, honestly, because you know, I've done a tremendous amount of research, historical research in
writing about the discovery of the New World, which was always this place of abundance where you could walk on the backs of salmon across the river, where Europe was literally starving. They came here looking for food, and they found it. And it became a place of bounty, America. So we have to sort of acknowledge that and try to change what America means, because it is the land of giant portions, of supersize it for a quarter, of all these sorts of things. And as consumers, to react against that is, I think, a really powerful way to start to change that culture. But there's no, like, when I try to explain to people, the reason for 25 cents you can get twice as many French fries is because the French fries are worthless. There's no money in the French fries. There's in the marketing, there's in the packaging, there's in the real estate, there's in all these other things where the marketing is, but the French fries are as good as garbage because there's a half a penny to the farm, whatever it is. So we sort of have to start thinking, I think, about food waste as part of those elements. It's about large portions, it's about buffets in Las Vegas, it's about what we do at home, it's about all these sorts of things that we take for granted that we all want as consumers in America and American places, and that we almost stand for, but we kind of have to start to rewrite that a little bit. That's a complicated answer. There's some really concrete things that people are doing, trying to keep food out of various things. At the Beard Foundation, we now negotiate with, when we're asked to participate in a festival, we now negotiate with that festival to make sure they have a food waste plan, a compost thing, that they're not telling chefs to cook for 20,000 people when they're only expecting 10,000 people. All these sorts of things, that there are opportunities to be mindful of that add to this problem. But it's a big problem. But almost throwing out that food is who we are. Like, we go and we go to Costco. Speaking of cashew, when you mentioned the cashew details, I just thought of those giant Costco cashew things that are like heaven when you see them. You're like, oh my God, more cashews than I've ever seen in my life. You know, and they're delicious and they're salty, and you don't have to pick them out of the mixed nuts the way you used to when you were a kid. You know. But like the consequences of that need to come to the front. But it's true, right? Like I just, that thing of cashews, just, I don't know, from my mother, those were the most prized things ever.
Yeah.
So all of that is part of this problem, right? And then they go
You eat
stale.
all those cashews. You're not
I eat a lot of cashews. Yeah, I don't want to throw them out. But not everyone eats those cashews. Not everyone eats everything they take home from the farmer's market. Trust me, I know. You know.
That's for sure.
So
I don't know, but I think, but Mitchell, I think, you know, there's a lot of parts about our culture that have fundamentally changed. I mean, like dramatic. I mean, littering used to be just totally accepted. Like it was no thing to just leave all of your trash wherever you were, right? And now, you know, there's still some folks who litter, but that's largely been eradicated.
Right.
And so,
seatbelts, things,
you know,
things change.
So I, you know, and I think we have a real opportunity on food waste, largely because everybody knows how it feels to throw away food, and it feels bad. Like we were all told there's some starving kid somewhere. How dare you eat all your food, which is not good on a health side. But we've been trained about like waste, and we know that it feels bad to dump a bunch of good food, right? And so I think there's that connection, which is why this issue compared to others, people have been working on it for a long time, but it really was like down here, and now all of a sudden it's just skyrocketing because it really sort of popped in our culture because we were ready for it. So I think one is making it taboo. And it is just unacceptable to be throwing that away. And I think that's starting. But I mean, that means like when you see somebody throwing something away, you're like, don't do that. Or like, what's your problem? Like you're killing the planet, we're all paying for that, not just you, because it's true. So I think that's like number one. Number two, our lives have been transformed in a million ways. But basically, like how we procure and cook our food at home is literally unchanged, besides the microwave, for about 75, 80, 90 years, right? Since electricity, essentially. And that's crazy. If you think about how fast we're moving and how much technology is helping us do all this other stuff. I think in the future, our fridges should be helping us manage our food and make sure that we're cooking things based on when they're going to go bad. I think our packages should tell us when things are actually going to go bad, not just when it's a random stamp. So a company can make sure their lawyers know that it's like, well, it's at least a month before that'll actually go bad, so we're safe legally, right? Which is how it's happening, right? So I think there's innovations that can happen that make this much easier for both retailers and consumers to manage their food systems better, because we're getting 40% of food waste coming from retail and distribution, and 40% in home. And so those are the big pockets to focus in on. So that means, in retail, it's like better packaging, better systems. I mean, in the future, I don't know, not that far, 5 years, maybe a little less, you're going to be able to know with your phone, there's be spectrometers on all of our phones, You'll be able to scan an orange and know how old it is, probably where it came from, how many more days until it goes bad, and eventually you'll know how that's going to taste just by a little light hitting it, right? That's a game changer. Now, depending on how we decide to use that technology, it could either create a lot more waste, or we could start having dynamic pricing models where when it's got 3 days left, people are retailers are selling it for super reduced prices, which could help us solve some of the access issues we're facing. Totally good food, delicious, nutritious, just doesn't have a lot of shelf life left. So those are the kind of things that I think we're going to need in a modern society to actually really crack these issues.
We're getting short on time here, but I have to ask this question of you, Joy. The question is about what's the role of chefs in promoting stigmatized foods, which we talked a little bit about on our prep call, or other local foods. So I'm thinking about how different foods have surged over the years, quinoa or kale or other things. So how do you think about...
What's like a stigmatized food?
So I think we talked about ugly food in the context of food waste. And then, actually in our prep conversation, we talked about how in some work that I had done in Kenya, there's a lot of, not just Kenya, many parts of Africa, there are foods that are actually considered scavenging foods. So they grow like weeds. If you eat them, it means you're really not able to afford to buy food, so you don't eat them. But in fact, they're some of the most nutritious foods there are. And so chefs in that region are picking them up and integrating them into their cuisines. And I'm just thinking about the role of chefs in influencing diets and how people think about foods differently. How do you think about that, or how do you see your colleagues in the restaurant industry thinking about that?
I see it as a challenge. I see it as, I could point to a handful of my chefs who are in their 20s that really think that the vegetables come from the walk-in. I mean, they don't know. They don't know where they came from. And therefore, if they, honestly, and if they drop a box of it on the floor, it's just an oopsie.
Right.
It's not like, oh my God, this just happened, and do you understand the path that it took to get here? Animal husbandry, the responsibility of taking that life, and then how you utilize that animal in its entirety is massive. So talking to the millennials, which is what I try to do, because then they communicate their every whim to one another. But really, just talking to the millennials, I think, makes a big difference, because they're going to take a picture of it, they're going to text it, and even when they don't understand it, they're going to share the information. So that's what we focus a lot of time and energy in our restaurant and training to our staff members, to the people who are handling the food, the awesome responsibility of that, and taking a step backwards from the beautiful package that it came in to where it was before that and before that and before that, and then how you have to use it from root to tip. We purposely take heirloom carrots and we scrub them clean, obviously, but we leave the ugly skins on those beautiful purple and gold and orange carrots, so that people look at it and they see that it's lovely, and also that it tastes good. And it saves us time, but it also teaches them that whatever, ugly is yummy, man, and so just get in there.
And I would say, at the Beard Foundation, years ago, we're celebrating our 30th anniversary this year, and 30 years ago, chefs were not the cultural trendsetters or tastemakers that they are now. And I don't know that 30 years from now they will be. I'm sure they won't be. But in this moment, for my world, my taste. But in this moment, I think it behooves us, and as an organization, we've doubled down on this to make sure that we're using that cultural capital they have to set some trends, whether it's bringing issues like food waste or ugly foods or whatever to light. We've even found in Washington they have political access that they have because of their celebrity, because like Top Chef isn't just entertainment. It actually sets a cultural trend. And so we think, we've even seen right now, this minute, there's one of the top chefs in the world is in Mexico cooking very expensive meals. Rene Redzepi of Noma has brought Noma to Tulum, Mexico, where you could be on the one hand, why is this Copenhagen Macedonian chef coming to Mexico to cook our food. But on the other hand, he has shone a spotlight on ingredients that no one's ever seen before except the natives, on other sort of stuff that help, we've heard, even locally, culturally, them see them in a different light. You know, we used to be the people who ate these weird things that no one else knew about, and now one of the greatest chefs in the world is shining the spotlight. I mean, there are all sorts of things come up in that conversation, but there's some value there to making, using a celebrity status or a spotlight, the power that you have to bring some things to light. And we think that's partly why we've been educating chefs in the last few years through our advocacy policy boot camps, because now's the time, carpe diem, like make something move.
It is that quintessentially American concept that you talked about. It's if we do care what Khloe Kardashian wears, you know, on the runway, then we also care what Tom Colicchio thinks about food waste. We just do, because
Right.
they're celebrities on a certain level, and when they have a voice that you listen to, then they can say important things and it makes a difference. So, not Khloe, Tom. You know what I mean? Yeah. So.
Chloe too. It only goes so far, but you got to use what you got.
Gotta use what you
gotta
got,
use
yeah.
everything.
I'm going to take a question from this side because I haven't taken one yet. This gentleman in the front.
So I'm interested to get your.
Is that on?
Yes.
Yeah.
So I'm interested to get your perspective about how you feel that the cultural trend and this foodie and local movement has potentially been the largest headwind of the sustainable utopia that you talk about going to, because you get all these things where you're trying to be getting the consumer a more sustainable and nutritious meal, and it's really tough to do that without the scientific innovations, and it hasn't been said yet, but I'll drop the G word, GMOs, where that brand has been destroyed by that foodie movement, and it prevents you from getting to that sustainable utopia because anything that has come to market so far to get us closer to that just gets destroyed by the cultural trend. So I'm curious on your guys' thoughts there.
The GMO question. There are several GMO-related
Yeah.
questions in here. That's a good question to finish on.
Well, I mean, you heard Sam describe our future. We're going to need all the tools we have at our disposal to produce enough food, wholesome food for everybody. I'm agnostic in some ways. I don't put my faith in giant for-profit companies always. I do put my faith in well-meaning scientists who are trying to find solutions to problems. And I don't believe you just turn it away. You know how to do something and you choose not to, and then we forget it. Unfortunately, our culture doesn't move that way. So I'm all for understanding genetic. I wouldn't even say genetic engineering, but the genetic makeup of our food and what that allows us to do, to know about our food and how to grow it. And when the time comes that we need to take advantage of that for societal reasons, I think we're going to need what we got.
Sort of to piss off both sides. Do I think that GMOs are safe? Absolutely. There's just no evidence that the GMO itself is dangerous at all. And I agree that on a lot of that side, the sort of demonization of the technology, the tool itself, has just been scientifically baseless. On the other hand, I don't think GMOs, certainly not as they've been produced now, are this panacea that are going to save us. So the hope that has been given to us that they're going to come and rescue us just hasn't manifested. Not because of the food movement, because the technology is limited in its expense, so it's only been used on a couple major crops for the most part because of the economics around it. And the value has not been actually done for consumers, it's been done for farmers and large-scale production. Now, I think that is about to totally change. So gene editing, CRISPR-Cas9, and a number of the other iterations holds tremendous promise to transform everything we eat. Everything. Which means basically editing within the genome of any given seed. So not GMOs are taking external DNA to insert them into a plant. Editing means just expressing or silencing different genes that currently sit in a plant. Which means you could breed wheat with 3-4 times the fiber. I think that's a pretty good thing. You could now start taking these innovations, because it's very cheap to do, very efficient to do, and start actually making fruits and vegetables much easier and more sustainably grown than they are now. Right now, part of the problem, pollen is just totally wrong. It's not subsidies. It's not the reason we have dramatic price disparity in our food system. It's because we've been innovating on corn and soy for about 75 years, and you're getting about 6 times the yield on 1 acre than you did about 75 years ago. Whereas fruits and vegetables, you're under 2 times the yield over the same time period. So the cost disparity is tremendous because we have not invested any money, essentially, into fruit and vegetable production. The question is, what are these tools being used for and for whom? What are we innovating on? Are we trying to produce more nutritious, more sustainably produced food that's actually nourishing the people that we're farming for? Because in so many of these discussions, nobody talks about eating. I cannot tell you how many thought leader conferences, ag conferences, all these things, nobody talks about food, ever. It's crazy. So there's a huge disconnect, and this is actually where chefs play a vital role because we're right in the middle between production and the consumer. But the question for us is, we have tools, how are we going to use them? And we are going to be in a moment where these tools can transform a lot of these issues that Jim was talking about. And it's going to be up to us to make sure that they are done for the right reasons, with the right outcomes, with the proper oversight to make sure they're safe. That right now, that's the big problem. There's no oversight to this. 0. It's considered grass. And any plant scientist can tell you they can manipulate any genome and create some incredible outcomes and some not incredible outcomes. So that's a big problem we got to fix. But I'm excited about where this goes, and I'm hopeful that the food movement takes a science-based approach to how we look and evaluate these technologies going forward.
I would also say, just to build up one thing, we are not in a situation now where we don't have enough food, which is another challenge. All of the panacea that it's supposed to be at this moment, I mean, not everyone's getting food. It depends on how you add it up and all that sort of stuff and how it's distributed. But let's wait until there's actually a reason, a problem we have to fix instead of inventing one that is more than maximizing profits or whatever it is that we consider to be the motivation, to his point. What are we solving for?
So we're out of time, which I know is disappointing because we have about 20 unanswered questions here, but we've reached the top of the meeting, and I've been jotting down words you all have been saying about the food system, where we need to go. I've got diversity, transparency, we talked about traceability, inclusiveness. Just as a final point, if we're going to get this right in 10, 15, 20 years, what are some of the hallmarks of the food system we're going to create over the next couple decades that I have, either that I've mentioned or things you haven't said yet? Any of you to wrap up?
I mean, I think investigation has got to become more natural to us. I think we just have to keep digging for answers. I think we have to, if we don't take it as proof now that our votes count, I don't know what would convince us, because we're in the midst of such divisiveness that I think we just have to understand how our needs and wants are reflected in the market, how the market follows what we tell it to follow, and how our representatives are there to listen to what we want and exercise the power to get it done. So just investigate.
Investigate.
I mean, I think back 30 years ago to what food we had available, and I mean, the change has been amazing. And I don't just mean in restaurants, I mean in grocery stores and places. I realize it's not across the board. There are places where there is no food, but the access we have to wholesome food in general, the varieties of food, healthful foods, is tremendous. And I think we need to find a way, I do believe we need to find a way to propel this change that is going on and keep it moving in a positive direction. I think we have to be mindful of the consequences. But if you ask any chef who cooked in America 30 years ago what was available just in the food system, forget at what price, or in a grocery store, a typical grocery store, and however we define that, and now you see it now. So I just think this constant diversity, this openness to new things, the fact that we are unburdened in some way by traditions in food is really powerful and bodes really well for the future. Of course, we have to be mindful of the values and all the things that it represents, but no question in my mind, many people eat much better today than they did before in America, and I think that we need to find a way for more people to be part of that.
Thank you.
I guess, so the keys for me are culture, innovation, and politics. And it's kind of the 3 pillars of, change in the future. And harnessing the momentum we have and nurturing it and cherishing it and feeding it and growing it, because it's the hardest thing to get, and once you lose it, you're done. The minute there's, like a big backlash, this whole food thing, it doesn't seem like a winner. We're actually not making that much progress. I'm going to go focus my efforts on somewhere else, getting us back into this moment where you just see so many things everywhere you go, from a science teacher to a school chef to James Beard. The fact that the James Beard Foundation by itself does all the work it's doing is an incredible testament. This was just an award organization that was like the Oscars for food. That's and it was great, but it celebrated fancy food, the fanciest chef. Who's the fanciest chef? Now, embedded in everything they do are all these issues. It's an incredible testament to how much change that's happening. It's happening everywhere. And so I think that's something that we need to value more than we do, and make sure we're fostering that for the future.
Great note to end on. If you wouldn't mind thanking our guests at the end of the program. All right. And thank you, audience, for all your good questions. Excellent.